much for, excuse me. Thanks for having me here. Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be presenting this paper, which is joint work with Andrea Ferrero and Shanshan Li from Oxford University and University of Liverpool, respectively. So this paper is about a topic that we've been talking a lot about in the last couple of days. And you will see that I'm going to take an approach that is almost at the opposite side of the spectrum of what Dima just did. A very elegant and very insightful model. I'm going to go with the butcher approach of having a very heavy and inelegant model, but hopefully complementary to some of these questions we've been talking about. So the motivation, I guess, it's kind of trivial to this crowd, but the way in which we're thinking about this paper is in relation to the transmission of monetary policy shocks, and obviously what happened in the last couple of years with the tightening cycles in advanced economies, and in particular in the US, just got many people also outside of this crowd interested in this kind of question. And the typical framework that we use to think about the transmission of monetary policy shocks is often relies on the notion of a trilemma, which was challenged a few years back in Jackson Hole's paper by Hélène, which basically consisted in her critique of this view consisted in two main ingredients. The first one was an empirical observation that asset prices and capital flows tend to co-move across countries, and there is a very strong common component driving those variables. But then there were some very important, the second aspect of her challenge was relating to the policy implications of the trilemma. And in particular, in her Jackson Hole paper, Hélène made the case for, or posed the question whether flexible exchange rates are actually enough to provide insulation to external shocks or shocks that drive this global financial cycle. And also made the case for the potential usefulness of additional instruments to achieve macroeconomic stability. Okay? And so these are the two questions that I have in this bullet. And what we want to do in this paper really is to try and revisit these questions that have been studied a lot in the last few years in a way that, as I said, I hope is going to be complementary to many of the studies that we've seen in the last couple of days and in previous work. And we're going to do this in an estimated open economy DSGE model. So it's a model that is going to have the key features that are going to allow us to replicate the global financial cycle evidence. And these key features, which I'm going to describe in a bit more detail in the next slides, basically rely on the notion of a dominant currency, both in trades and in financial markets. Now, more specifically, what we do in the paper, we proceed in three separate steps. In the first step, we estimate a panel VAR, where we estimate the response of macro and financial variables to a US monetary policy shock. We're going to focus on the typical small open economy. Okay, so there's been a lot of work, as we've seen also in this conference, on the transmission of US monetary policy shocks. Here we're going to focus on small open economies with a flexible exchange rate, which is going to is a key aspect to answer the question that we have in mind. And we're going to show that, in line with previous evidence as well, that the demand or financial channel of monetary policy transmission dominates over the expenditure switching effect, which is kind of a manifestation, if you like, of the notion of a global financial cycle being at play. After having estimated our panel VAR, we're going to write down a two-country DSGE model that we're going to bring to the data and we're going to estimate by matching the impulse responses of the VAR. And as I mentioned, we're going to add frictions in international financial markets as well as in trades. And I'm going to show you how these frictions we're going to add are going to be absolutely crucial to match the evidence that we have in our panel VAR, in our empirical part of the paper. And finally, once we have our estimated DSG, we can play around with it and think about policy experiments. And in particular, we're going to do a few counterfactuals where we're going to compare the benefits of having a flexible exchange rate. We're going to vary the degree of exchange rate flexibility in the model and see what that implies for real outcomes, the volatility of macro variables in welfare. And we're also going to consider, again in line with the Lens paper at Jackson Hole, whether the addition of some instruments, macroprudential instruments or capital flow management instruments, can mitigate the consequences of the global financial cycle. We're going to also consider a case in which, of an economy which has a pegged exchange rate and is going to introduce this tool, these macroprudential tools, and try to compare these various cases. Okay, so that's really what we want to do. We want to exploit kind of, the insights from the empirical evidence, the insights from a relatively large DSG model that we estimate, and then run these policy experiments in our estimated DSG. Of course, we are building on a very, very large literature on this topic. Most of you probably can spot your name in this list, which is definitely complete. And for sake of time, I'm going to skip these slides and move directly into the, the empirical evidence. So, as I mentioned, we have a panel of countries. We're going to focus on 15 economies with a flexible exchange rate. The list of countries we have in the first bullet, so as you can see, we have a mix of advanced and emerging economies in the sample. And as I mentioned already, here what we really focus and what is key for our analysis is to select countries that have a very flexible exchange rate. So what we do, we go to the Ilczewski, Reiner, Rogoff classification, and we select the first 15 countries in terms of their classification of exchange rate flexibility. And we play around with different set of countries in robustness analysis. We're going to consider a set of variables that is the most, we think, the most parsimonious way to characterize the effects of a global financial cycle. So we're going to consider, for the US, a monetary policy surprise, a variable that measures, that is linked at least to financial frictions in financial markets or on the side of intermediaries, the excess bond premium in particular, and a measure of real outcomes, real GDP. While in this domestic small open economy, we're going to consider real GDP, CPI, exports, the policy rates, the nominal exchange rate, and another measure that is linked to financial frictions, which is corporate bond spreads in the local economy. We're going to work at monthly frequency, and we're going to have a sample that runs from 97 till just before the COVID crisis. Really what constrains here our sample period is the presence or the availability of credit spreads, which is, if you want, or if you like, the only addition that we bring to this literature, given that there is really a lot of work on the transmission of monetary policy shocks internationally. So we construct these corporate bond spreads starting from microdata and at the country level, and these data are available only from 97. But again, we do robustness with different sample periods, dropping corporate bond spreads. And as Sylvia and Hélène do in their Ristad paper, we interpolate macro series, in this case real GDP and exports, to the monthly frequency in our baseline. But again, we provide a lot of robustness exercise where we use other measures in the paper. Okay, so how does our panel VAR looks like? I mentioned we use a monetary policy surprise. In our baseline, we use the monetary policy surprises by Jaroczynski and Karadi, which again have been discussed already quite a lot in the past few days. We're going to plug these surprises directly into our specification of the VAR, so we're going to use them as an internal instrument in our VAR. And as you can see, there are two blocks of the VAR here. There is a US block that contains the monetary policy surprise, the excess bond premium, and US GDP, and the small open economy variables, which are denoted by an I subscript. And we have GDP, CPI, the exports, the policy rates, the exchange rates, and credit spreads. As I mentioned, we picked a relatively parsimonious specification that we can then expand in robustness. Now, going back to some of the points we discussed yesterday, this is for Luciana's paper, given that we are focusing, as I mentioned, on a relatively diverse set of countries, we have advanced and emerging economies, there is a risk of basically the dynamic slope coefficients, i.e. these coefficients F here, to be quite heterogeneous across countries, which could lead to some biases if we were to pool all this data into a fixed effects panel. And so what we do, we use the mean group estimator, which instead deals with this problem. And that basically means we run this OL with these VARs country by country, and then we take a simple average to construct our panel estimator, and we can construct confidence intervals in a way that is described in this paper by Pesaran and Smith. So this is what we get out from our panel VAR. I'm going to just guide you through the way in which we interpret these responses, starting from what happens in the US. So the top row here is plots the response of US variables. And you can see that even though it's kind of a very parsimonious way to represent what monetary policy shocks do within a given economy, you can see that there is a very standard US transmission. A tightening in policy leads to an increase in the excess bond premium. In this case, note that we normalize the shock such that it leads to a 25 basis points increase in the EBP. This is roughly speaking a 2 standard deviation shock in the work, for example, by Gertler and Karadi, just to give you a sense of the magnitude of the shock that we use. So there is a tightening in financial conditions, and there is a fall in economic activity with a classic hump shape and magnitudes that are in line with previous estimates. Now let's move to what we think is the most interesting bit of the analysis, which is what happens to the local economy, the small open economy. Let me start by highlighting that there is, again, something standard that you would expect happening, which is a depreciation of the nominal exchange rate in the small open economy. But then there are things that are, at least if you start from the notion of the framework in the trilemma, there are less, or if you start from a Mundelian framework, are less standard. The first thing that we note is that there is co-movement of corporate bond spreads across countries. And this is a first manifestation of financial frictions being at play, as well as a global financial cycle being at play, given the co-movement and the tightening in financial conditions across countries. The second thing is that the expenditure switching effect doesn't seem to dominate over a demand or financial channel of monetary policy transmission. Why do I say that? Well, because despite the effects depreciation in the small open economy, you have that exports do not increase. Indeed, they fall, and quite severely, if you look at the magnitudes. And this leads to a fall in real GDP. And you can see that what happens to CPI inflation overall, you have two opposing forces here. You have the imported inflation going up because of the depreciation, but you have the demand or financial channel pushing down instead on CPI inflation, which leads to a very flat, near zero, and very insignificant response. Think of this as the average country in our sample, okay? So this would be the average response, and that would be the average response of CPI, which is in line with this strong response of real GDP and exports. And finally, how does the small open economy respond in terms of the policy rate? You have a very tiny tightening of monetary policy, which is barely significant, and eventually there is not much response, which you can think in different way. You can think that either the policy rate is just responding to the tiny blip in inflation that we have on impact, or you can think of these economies having some form of response to the exchange rate. Remember, these are flexible exchange rates, but nothing prevents these economies to have some embedded response to exchange rates in a monetary policy rule. So we think that this evidence is consistent with previous evidence on the global financial cycle hypothesis. We stress the fact that these demand and financial amplification channels dominate over the expenditure switching channel to make sense of what we observe in the data. And as I mentioned already, we do a lot of robustness exercises. We consider a larger sample of countries. We also consider a longer sample period where we drop our variable of credit spreads, and so on and so forth. And you can see in the paper that the results are, or at least the impulse responses have shown, are very, very robust to all of these exercises. Right, so given this empirical evidence, I'm going to move now to the two-country ESG, and we're going to build on the work by Aoki, Benigno, and Kiyotaki, and in particular the work by Ozer, Akinci, and Albert Caralto. We're going to have, I'm not going to have time to kind of go through the model. As I said, this is on the opposite side of the spectrum of a simple, elegant model. We're going to have a lot of ingredients. So what I'm going to try and do is to give you a sense of the main ingredients that we have without going into much detail. I hope you're going to get the intuition for what are the important mechanisms at play. So the household sector is going to be kind of uninteresting and symmetric across the two economies. What makes the model kind of more interesting and more, in a sense, particular is an asymmetric international financial structures. We're going to have banks, both in the foreign economy and in the domestic economy. And the asymmetry comes from the fact that foreign banks are going to raise funds domestically, but they're going to operate internationally. So they're going to lend both to their own foreign firms, but also to the small open economy firms. So think of these as being the hegemon, or the US, if you like. While home banks are going to be raising funds domestically, but also they're going to borrow internationally from these global banks. Okay? So you can see that there is an asymmetric nature, and we're going to therefore think of the home economy as the small open economy. We're also going to have a relatively sophisticated production side of the economy. We're going to have 4 different types of firms. And this in particular is going to allow us to, as I mentioned before, to match some of the salient features of the global financial cycle. In particular, we're going to assume an asymmetric pricing when it comes to international trade. We're going to assume that in the home economy, firms are going to adopt a local currency pricing paradigm, while this is not going to be true in the US. So the US is going to be producer currency pricing, while there's going to be local currency pricing at home. And this is going to allow us to mimic the notion of a dominant currency pricing paradigm as documented by previous papers. And we're also going to introduce a notion of imperfect pass-through, which I'm going to show you is going to be important to match empirical evidence, which means that the law of one price, from the point of view of the home economy, is only going to hold at the dock. So I'm an importer. I'm going to import goods from you guys. You guys are the US. And I'm going to adjust prices only infrequently, so there's going to be limited pass-through from import prices into domestic CPI. So in a sense, as I mentioned before, the model is a model that has a dominant currency notion, both in trade and in finance. So I'm going to try and give you a schematic idea of how the model works. So we're going to have and this is going to be related to the financial flows in the model. So as I mentioned, there is a hegemon, which has global banks that fund themselves from foreign households and lend to domestic firms. There is a similar structure in the receiving economy, but what makes the model kind of interesting is this asymmetric nature of international financial flows, where foreign banks are going to lend to local banks. So the key here is that these local banks are going to fund themselves from domestic deposits and international borrowing in interbank markets. Okay? Now, an additional word on how these banks work, given that they play a crucial role in the model. These are modeled as a standard Gertler and Karadi agent. So the foreign banks are going to have their balance sheet fully denominated in dollars. And they're going to, as I mentioned, issue deposits to foreign households and lend to both domestic firms and small open economy banks. The small open economy banks are going to be more interesting. So as we mentioned, they're going to fund deposits domestically, and they're going to also raise funds internationally. B-star is going to be interbank borrowing from global banks. And they're going to use these 2 sources of funds plus net worth to lend to small open economy firms. Now, as in Akinci-Keralto, we're going to assume that these bankers can divert a fraction of their assets. This is the Gertler-Karadi part. But this fraction is going to be increasing in the foreign currency share of borrowing over total assets. In other words, the higher is my leverage in foreign currency, the more I can run away with a fraction of my assets, which basically means, you can think of this as being that foreign funds are harder to recover than domestic funds. And what this leads to is basically an endogenous UIP wedge conditional on shocks that can drive a global financial cycle type of dynamic, like monetary policy shocks. Okay? So it's really the combination of this balance sheet mismatch and the presence of a moral hazard on these intermediaries that is going to lead to this endogenous UIP wedge. Again, very quickly on how the production side of the economy looks like. Apologies if this is confusing, but for those of you who know roughly how the model works, we're going to have capital producers, which are going to introduce a role for the price of capital. This is very standard. These are our intermediate goods producers, which again are quite standard. We're going to have monopolistic retailers. This is where the sticky prices and the LCP assumption is going to kick in. And these are the importers, which I mentioned already. We're going to assume some imperfect pass-through based on the work by Tommaso Monacelli in an older paper. So this is roughly how the economy works. I hope I gave you a sense of how, what are the relevant ingredients. Let me just now describe the policy rule, and then I can move to how we estimate the model. So the monetary policy rule, again, is asymmetric and is a standard rule apart from one ingredient here. So we allow the interest rate, the policy rate set by the central bank, to respond to exchange rate fluctuations, potentially. But again, this is going to be asymmetric. We're going to assume that this coefficient that governs this response is going to be 0 in the US. So in the US, you can think of a very standard Taylor rule. While in the small open economy, we're going to allow this coefficient to be different from 0. And in a sense, we're going to be allowing for a fully flexible regime if this phi curly E is going to be equal to 0 up to a peg if you think about this coefficient going to infinity. Okay? And we're going to estimate this model by doing impulse response matching and then play around with this coefficient in our counterfactual exercises. We're also going to introduce, again, in an asymmetric way, some additional instruments. And in particular, these I'm going to describe them a bit more carefully in the policy analysis that I'm going to do in a couple of minutes. Again, these instruments are going to be only in the small open economy, only in the home country, and we're going to think of two different taxes. A tax on foreign currency borrowing, think of these as capital flow management measures or capital controls, and a tax on total credits in the small open economy that you can think of as a standard macroprudential policy in the small open economy. Okay, jumping to the estimation. So the way in which we proceed, we are going to fix some of the parameters that we think are maybe less controversial in terms of what we know from the literature. And then we're going to estimate the remaining parameters, which are kind of absent here, and some additional ones, which I think are interesting and important to match the evidence by doing impulse response matching. Okay, so we're going to try and match the impulse response. We're going to try and minimize the impulse responses of the DSG from the impulse responses of the VAR. Maybe the only thing that's worth mentioning here is that we set the size of the home economy, this is the small open economy, 2.1, which is in line with the size of the countries that we use in the empirical analysis. And similarly, we pick the home biasing consumption parameter here to match the share of exports in GDP that is consistent with the countries in our sample over the sample period we consider. So just to have a reasonably calibrated part of the model when it comes to size and share of exports. Right, so the impulse response matching procedure is quite standard. We adopt a Bayesian approach. So we have some priors on some of the parameters. We minimize the distance between the black line, which is the DSGE response, and the green line, which is the VAR response, taking into account the uncertainty around these mean estimates, which are going to basically act as weights in the impulse response matching procedure. This is very standard. So this is what comes out of the estimation. As you can see, we do a reasonably decent job at matching the dynamics, especially of the policy at the financial variables, credit spreads, the exchange rate, and the interest rate. We do a good job at matching inflation, a decent job at matching real GDP, and not a very good job at matching export, even though we are still within reasonable confidence intervals. We're still working on this aspect of the analysis. I actually had very insightful conversations with some of you yesterday on what may be going on here, but I'll defer this to chats in the coffee. So the overall sense that we get is that we can match relatively well the global financial cycle effects of the monetary policy shocks that we estimate for the VAR. Now what I want to do, this is just how the estimated parameters come out. Maybe one thing to mention is that we get, if you compare our priors and the posterior, you can see that the data is actually our impulse responses are actually quite informative for the estimation. Just let me skip this for sake of time. And let me quickly mention why the ingredients we introduced are important to be able to match the evidence. The first thing I want to do is to shut down financial friction. So I'm going to just kill the moral hazard ingredient in the model. I can do it either in both the domestic, only in the domestic economy or only in the foreign economy. And the main thing I want you to take away is that financial frictions are really crucial to A, generate amplification. That's kind of, maybe obvious. They're obviously important to match the evidence on credit spreads, but also they're very important to match the size of the exchange rate depreciation, because via the endogenous UAP wedge that is caused by the financial frictions, we get an additional amplification that feeds into the exchange rate. The second ingredient that I wanted to mention is the role of the asymmetric pricing assumption we made. Remember, home firms do local currency pricing, US firms do producer currency pricing. The red line here shows what happens if we were to do producer currency pricing in the two countries. And you can see that, of course, we wouldn't be able to match the sign, not even the size, but the sign of exports. And this is kind of obvious because the LCP assumption makes exports not sensitive at all to fluctuations in exchange rate. And you would actually go back to something that would be closer to a Mandela world, where you have a big boom in export that eventually could even lead to an increase in GDP in the home economy and a big spike in inflation. When it comes to inflation, here's the third ingredient that I mentioned. So if you remember, we assume there are imperfect pass-through. So we assume that a law of one price holds only at the dock. And this is the chart I want you to focus on. The red line here is what we would get if we were to remove the assumption of imperfect pass-through. And as you can see, without this assumption, we would have that the strong depreciation that we get from the monetary policy shock is going to lead to an immediate spike in inflation, which is clearly due to the depreciation in imported goods from the point of view of the small open economy. So we think that this ingredient is actually very important to match the unresponsiveness of inflation to the shock. Now I have a couple of minutes left, and so what I want to do in the last couple of minutes is to show you some experiments that we can do with our estimated ESG. The first thing I want to do is to kind of go back to the original critique or challenge of Hélène to the trilemma hypothesis and think about the role of exchange rate flexibility. So the question here is whether or how much the exchange rate regime is irrelevant or relevant to shocks that generate global financial cycle type of dynamics. What I have here is a bunch of impulse responses that I get by varying the response of in the Taylor rule to exchange rates. Just focus on the red dashed line, which is a currency peg. So you let this economy to respond very strongly to movements in exchange rate, which leads to no movement whatsoever in the nominal exchange rate. And maybe not surprisingly to most of you, going for a peg really increases the amount of volatility in the economy. So in a sense, the only point we want to make here, if you look at the magnitudes, is that the exchange rates regime is really not irrelevant. But what I think is the most interesting part of this, of the policy analysis, is to think about additional instruments. Again, I'm going back to Helene's kind of original Jackson Hole paper and thinking about, okay, if I introduce additional instruments, can I achieve better outcomes in terms of allocation of, or can I achieve better real outcomes? So I'm going to consider two taxes. One tax on total credit, which is basically reducing the total return on the portfolio of loans that banks in the home economy do. And a second tax that instead is going to increase the cost of foreign currency borrowing from the point of view of the local bank. Okay? And I'm going to specify a policy rule for both taxes that depends on total credit in the economy. Okay? So once I have these rules, I can then put them at play, and I can find, we're going to basically look and find a coefficient that maximizes households' welfare conditional on the estimated version of the model. And we can see how, with this rule in place, either the macro pro rule or the capital control rule, what kind of allocations we get. So this is what I'm showing you here, conditional on the macroprudential policy rule. So remember, this is a tax on total credit. Well, in this case, it's a subsidy, given that there is a negative shock. And what you can see from the red line, which is what we would get in a world with this additional instrument at play, is that this macroprudential rule is actually doing a great job at stabilizing the economy. So you can see that the rule is going to, which is acting directly on credit spreads, is going to compress credit spreads. So it's going to have a strong effect on the financial friction of the economy. It's going to dramatically reduce the effect of the monetary policy shock in the US in the small open economy when it comes to GDP. But it has in a sense, kind of a very small side effect, which is going to lead to a slightly higher increase in inflation, which also leads to a slightly higher increase in the policy rate. Now, how does this compare to the foreign borrowing, the capital control rule? Well, it turns out that these two rules are actually work in a relatively similar way. The capital control rule is also going to compress credit spreads, is going to reduce volatility in output, but differently from the macroprudential rule, there's going to be a different response in inflation here, which mainly comes from the effect on the exchange rate, and this kind of obvious if you think that the capital controls rule is basically acting directly on the wedge, on the UIP wedge, that causes amplification in nominal exchange rate. But the bottom line I want you to get from these pictures is that, you can think of these two rules as being kind of substitutes and achieve similar outcomes. Last slide, and then I'll stop. The last exercise we think of or we want to consider is a country that does a PEG, but also on top of it has one of these two rules at play. I'm showing you here the macroprudential policy rule. Just for reference, the red dashed line is what you would get with the currency peg with no rule whatsoever. So black is the baseline, red is a word with a peg, and blue is a word with a peg plus the macroprudential rule at play, where again we find the coefficient in the rule that maximizes household welfare. And this is quite interesting because you can see that the allocation that you get out of this experiment is not too dissimilar from the previous two. So again, you can limit a lot the response of output. You can limit a lot the response of credit spreads. But in a sense, this comes at the cost of much higher volatility when it comes to inflation. If you remember the previous numbers, inflation was going up by less than 0.1%. Here, inflation actually falls because the nominal interest rate increases and the nominal exchange rate does not depreciate. But these numbers are much larger. And if you compare the real GDP number as well, you get a much stronger effect. Yet, it was surprising to us to find, what I would describe as quite powerful effects from these rules in a world where you have a peg. I'm out of time, so I'm just going to leave you with basically this slide that summarizes what I just said. Just a word on what we're planning to do. So as I said, we want to understand a bit better the response of exports. And we're also trying to do a bit more formal welfare analysis. I've shown you a bunch of inputs responses, and we're looking at volatilities, but then the next step in the paper is to be a bit more formal in terms of trying to assess the welfare effects of these different policy rules. And with this, I'll stop, and I'm looking forward to Tatjana's comments. Thanks.
All right. Thanks so much to the organizers for inviting me to discuss this paper today. So in a nutshell, the paper quantitatively revisits an old question. So do flexible exchange rates insulate from US monetary policy tightening? And the paper builds on three main building blocks in the literature. So following a US monetary policy tightening, the classical Mandel-Fleming framework suggests that there is a trilemma, so that flexible exchange rates help with macro adjustment while you can still independently conduct monetary policy, because there is an expenditure switching channel such that an FX depreciation following the US monetary policy tightening actually boosts exports and helps with the recovery. Then Elaine Ray, building on her Jackson Hole lecture, says, well, there's actually a dilemma. So there's no insulation from the global financial cycle, regardless of the exchange rate regime. And that's because there's a powerful financial channel, so that in the presence of strong financial spillovers from the core countries, so from the US to the periphery, there may be even a perverse effect where a monetary contraction in the periphery country is actually expansionary, so not contractionary. And so that's because capital flows are pro-cyclical and borrowing costs are counter-cyclical, driven by the global financial cycle. And then finally, the third building block is more recent work by Gopinath et al. On the dominant currency paradigm that suggests that there's little to no macro adjustment from an FX depreciation because the expenditure switching channel is actually muted when global trade goes down altogether following a US dollar appreciation. Ultimately, how these channels operate is an empirical question. This is what this paper tries to answer in a quantitative framework. And so it uses, on the one hand, a panel VAR with the classical Yarczynski-Karady shocks, Cholesky identification, all very standard, and then uses a two-country DSGE model that is matched to the VAR using some combination of financial frictions, so cross-border lending, and nominal real frictions, incomplete exchange rate pass-through, and I'm going to refer to local currency pricing as dominant currency pricing throughout this presentation, so some DCP for the empirical fit. And just to mention a difference to a standard small open economy model that has been used widely in the literature is that here in this model we have some feedback from financial frictions in the core country as well, so in the, say, US, and some foreign demand contraction that is not just modeled in reduced form. And then ultimately the paper tries to answer, should we nonetheless stick with a flexible exchange rate regime by looking at some counterfactuals, what happens under a peg, and how can we introduce some taxes on domestic credit and foreign capital flows to improve on outcomes. So the paper builds on a lot of literature. I'm just mentioning a couple of papers here that might be relevant as well that I was maybe missing from the literature review. But I think the key contribution of this paper is really that it revisits the dilemma in a quantitative framework that is really matched to empirical evidence cross-country and uses these three core frictions, so including dominant currency pricing or local currency pricing and dominant currency financing, and considers financial frictions also in the core country, in the hegemon country, and how they spill over through an endogenous ULP premium. So I think it's a very nice combination of a model and cross-country evidence, and the paper is really well written and without much fuzz, as I would say, without like big belts and whistles. Just briefly, the key results, the model fits the data well. The VAR results are very robust and suggest that flexible exchange rate regimes do not offer enough insulation to the global financial cycle. The financial frictions, incomplete pass-through, and local currency pricing are very relevant in explaining spillovers, and the financial channel seems to dominate the expenditure switching channel. So Mundell-Fleming in that sense doesn't hold. And then the policy counterfactuals show that flexible exchange rates and domestic macroprudential policy measures, I'm going to refer to MPMs and CFMs in the IMF terminology, sorry for that, but acronyms always help to squeeze it on one page. So they achieve the highest combination of welfare gains and limited macro volatility. And in fact, the PEG increases macro volatility, which is not surprising, as we already heard from others, because you forego independent countercyclical monetary policy. But that can still be mitigated through a combination of CFMs and MPMs of taxes. So just a couple of comments and food for thought on the paper. So first of all, the paper considers cross-country both EMs and AEs. In the extension also 24 economies. But I'm wondering whether bunching those countries together actually veils a lot of heterogeneity. The whole narrative is spun much more in the direction of emerging markets, I would say, and how they are vulnerable to the global financial cycle. And we can see potentially the problem with that in the impulse responses in the VAR. So we have a nominal exchange rate depreciation, but then we see very insignificant results on inflation with very wide confidence bands. And in fact, the literature tells us that exchange rate pass-through to CPI inflation may be heterogeneous across countries. So emerging markets tend to have higher exchange rate pass-through, higher currency risk premia, potentially also ex-ante fewer CFM MPMs in place, whereas advanced economies have much stronger monetary policy frameworks, they are stronger inflation targeters, have lower reserves and lower currency mismatches. So here's some work by colleagues at the IMF that have found that emerging markets actually have much higher pass-through rate of a nominal exchange rate depreciation to consumer prices. And this is although there is a similar response of import prices, so what Ambrogio called at the dock import prices, where they find actually close to complete pass-through. Of course, there's lots of evidence out there, also some evidence suggesting that exchange rate pass-through has decreased a lot over time, but this is really like a sample of more than 60 countries over more than 20 years, showing some heterogeneous pass-through. So looking also at the other two frictions in the model, DCP, so both advanced economies and emerging markets show high levels of currency invoicing in US dollars, but still there is some heterogeneity in the sense that emerging markets have even more DCP. And then also looking at financial frictions, we know from the literature that UIP premia in advanced economies are on average 0 over time, and reflect more deviations from full information measurable expectations, whereas in emerging markets, they tend to be positive, reflecting risk premia. So all of this is just to suggest that bunching the countries together may veil a lot of heterogeneity, and may therefore also have different implications for the quantitative results of the model, in the sense that there's some mixed evidence of the directions that inflation takes in the impulse responses. And I think that's important for the policy implications, because ultimately the inflation channel will mean that an exchange rate depreciation will have a strong real income effect if exchange rate pass-through is high, which will also imply less expenditure switching. The policy rate responds very strongly to inflation, more than to output, which will further raise credit spreads and exacerbate financial friction. So I think it is important to distinguish a little bit more between advanced and emerging markets. So one could estimate the VR and exchange rate pass-through separately for these countries, and even also consider nonlinear exchange rate pass-through, so that you only have high pass-through when there's a very large depreciation, in essence. Then a second comment, and Ambrogio already mentioned it. So all of these impulse responses from the model look very fine and match the data very well, except for that one outlier here, right? Exports. So is that maybe because of limited expenditure switching, or because the financial channel in the model is actually not strong enough to lead to a big contraction? I was wondering, and I don't know what your conversation were earlier with others, but I was wondering if maybe the dominant currency pricing channel is not strong enough. And that could be tackled, for example, by expanding the model from a 2-country to a 3-country framework to really allow for a strong contraction in global trade, such that a US monetary policy tightening appreciates the US dollar and leads to a contraction in trade everywhere, so that also the third country, which is essentially a mirror image of the home country, will see a contraction in output and in trade and domestic demand, which will then more likely lead to such a protracted contraction in exports. And we can see that also from the Gopinath et al. Paper, that DCP in the 3-country model actually leads to a large contraction. And ultimately, I think that's important, because if it is in fact dominant currency pricing, that explains in the data why flexible exchange rate don't bring about enough expenditure switching or trade to counter the financial channel, then it is even a stronger case for CFM MPMs for taxes to target the financial frictions in the model to ease monetary policy trade-offs. Third comment, I'm just going to keep it brief. So the whole narrative is around the global financial cycle, which is about large curve movements and asset prices, and we've seen that through the curve movements and spreads and credit spreads. But the global financial cycle is also about credit cycles, so not just about risk-off shocks, but also risk-on shocks. So to strengthen the narrative a bit more, one could also consider what what happens in response to US monetary policy easing in the VAR? Would we see the corresponding flow of capital into small open economies, as the global financial cycle suggests? And the VAR could also be backed up by variables that speak more to the global financial cycle, such as leverage and credit contraction and capital flows, rather than just credit spreads. Maybe that may also help you overcome the sample issue of a limited sample of credit spreads. Finally, okay, I'm going to skip this one because you actually answered that. I was wondering if you are using only pure monetary policy shocks or a mix of both. So I'm going to skip that. And then finally, on the difference between credit taxes, so macroprudential policy measures in the model, and capital flow income taxes. I noticed that the welfare gains under the MPMs are actually the largest relative to macro volatility, which is also what evidence, more recent evidence, suggests. But at the end of the day, the tax on capital inflows also constrains banks in levering up in credit extension. So could we find an optimal level of the tax on foreign capital inflows that would replicate the same welfare gains that the macroprudential policy measure can achieve? So maybe just a little bit more discussion on how these two tools differ, or how they are the same in your model, or if they are essentially targeting the same externalities, then maybe you could think about how you could design them in a different way so that they target the externalities more explicitly. All right, I'll stop here in the interest of time. So I think this is a very nice paper, really enjoyed reading it, and yeah, main suggestion is just to differentiate more between advanced and emerging market economies. Thanks so much.
All right, I'm going to take a couple of minutes to answer to these great points that Tatjana made. So on heterogeneity, so the first point was about heterogeneity. So as I said, we're mixing advanced and emerging economies. I'm sympathetic to the comment. You know, we can try and do it for advanced economies only. I wouldn't be able to do it for emerging economies only because I want flexible exchange rates. And I need a large panel to be able to estimate carefully the mean group. So I think I'm sympathetic to the comment. The only thing I want to mention is that, you know, the model is going to be able to match, given these three ingredients, my hunch is that the model is going to be able to match any kind of permutation of the average country. And so you're right that our average country at the moment is a bit of a weird beast because it mixes some stuff. But you know, if you were to consider a different average country, the model will have a very good shot at matching whatever. Whether the implications will still hold, it's a good question, and so that's why I'm sympathetic to the comment. So that's something we will definitely do. On exports, I really like the comment. It goes actually similar lines to what I've been discussing with others. You mentioned, you know, it could extend. So the issue here is exports do not respond as much in the model as in the data. Tatjana suggested we can go to a fully fledged three-country world where the dominant currency paradigm is better specified. You know, in our setup, we just mimic it. You would need a three-country setup to actually carefully describe it. The other option would be to write a model of roundabout production where you have, you know, some form of GVC. You have intermediate inputs that you export to produce in both the UK, in the domestic economy and the US. And that would, I think, allow us, and this was the suggestion that I was discussing actually with Yorgo yesterday, would allow us to give an additional kick. The other option, and I really would like to hear what you guys think about it, maybe over coffee. The other thing we were thinking about was to, you know, there is some evidence that working capital constraints are stronger and more severe for exporting firms. And so we're thinking about adding that kind of constraint where you need to finance some of your, you know, wage bill and your costs. And this is kind of relatively stronger for exporters. That would lead to a stronger fall in exports. Then you had a comment about the global financial cycle. Again, I'm sympathetic to that. You know, we focus here on the monetary policy shock mainly because of the impulse-response matching. We have previous work where we actually looked more carefully at leverage. Actually, this builds on previous work with Andrea and Alessandro Rebucci, where we're considering shocks to leverage of global financial intermediaries. So there is all that notion that we don't touch on in this paper, but you're right that we can probably bring it up a bit more, and we can do that certainly in the new version of the draft. And then the last point was about the different policy rules, and again, this is very much work in progress. We're still trying to work out exactly what's going on, given that we're getting these welfare numbers numerically. I just wanted to clarify one thing, because I think I went a bit quickly in my presentation. So the two taxes that we consider, a tax on foreign borrowing and a tax on the total lending portfolio of the bank, are going to act on two different wedges in the model. So the tax on foreign borrowing has a direct effect on the endogenous UAP wedge that arises when there is a shock in the foreign economy. Okay? While the macro pro tax instead is going to act on the total credit spreads in the economy. So I think eventually, and this goes back to your first point, I think it really depends, the optimality is going to depend on whether you are a country where these UAP variations are very important, maybe much more so than domestic credit spreads, or the opposites, if you have instead that domestic credit spreads vary much more than UIP variation. So I think this is the margin that can make these two taxes preferable depending on the setup that you consider. But as I said, this is we're still working on it, and I think this comment is going to be useful to try and get to the bottom of it. So with that, thank you very much, really useful comments, and I'm happy to take questions if there are any, or if we're all in need of coffee, I'm very happy to discuss over coffee. Thanks.
I think the paper is very ambitious to challenge the trilemma. To do that, I think you might want to consider to look at price stability versus macroeconomic stability as a measurement, to answer the question. My second comment or question. I just try to understand the parameter attached to exchange rate in your monetary policy rule in the domestic economy. Why you vary this parameter will give you floating exchange rate and the pegged exchange rate? To me, it's just the magnitude that how policy instrument in response to changes in exchange rate. Another comment would be, I agree with the discussant that macroprudential policy tax on capital inflows gives you, or pretty differently, is welfare improving is something a little bit old. I think you might want to look into it. Yeah, thank you.
Are we collecting? Oh, no. So thanks. In reverse order, through the lens of the model, the tax on foreign borrowing obviously is going to reduce volatility, because it's going to act on a friction that generates amplification in the model. So intuitively, from the point of view of the model, it's going to just dampen UIP deviations, which generate amplification in the model, and so you are really acting directly on the main friction, one of the main frictions that the model has. So it's not surprising to me that it leads to an improvement in welfare. The surprising bit is whether it does lead to a better or a higher improving welfare relative to a macroprudential tax. Our results show that it's not obvious that it is better or worse. At the moment they seem it's more of an equivalence result rather than a better. And as I said, this part is still in progress, but I'm not sure I understand your confusion about why a tax can lead to welfare improvements, but we can discuss over coffee. For the monetary policy rule, you simply, if the exchange rate depreciates, you raise interest rates, then it's going to limit the depreciation. Again, the more you do, the more you're going to limit the depreciation, and in the limit, you're going to peg your currency. But again, if this is not clear, we can chat over coffee. I think I think we can clarify this. It's relatively standard, I would say.
Just a follow-up on Tatjana's comments on heterogeneity. had the same feeling that there are two variables at least, where probably you have lots of heterogeneity underneath. And it would be nice to see it, if you could show kind of a chart with all of the responses. And these two variables are policy response, the interest rate, and CPI. And if you think of the advanced economies, Germany, Canada, probably the UK, with such a contraction in GDP, you would expect an easing from policy. And now the question is, why not? And I suppose that's due to the composition. And in our paper, in fact, we find that advanced economies do ease when there's a tightening in the US, because in our case, both output and inflation contract. And that's also interesting that you find instead that inflation does not respond, because what would be my prior is that you would have a contraction of inflation, downward pressure on prices through the oil channel, this commodity price channel, for advanced economies, and then smaller economies perhaps have upward pressure, and perhaps on balance you find this, this neutral response. And it would be also nice to look at the difference between core and the headline, probably, if that channel I have in mind is at play at all. And there's also a new paper from Benigno and co-authors that explore this role for oil in the transmission. And also I have a final sort of question or comment. What's happening with inflation? Because the two charts look different.
Sorry, these are, okay. Let me clarify again in reverse order. I should have mentioned this actually. So these impulse responses from the VAR are, as I described, the VAR a monthly frequency with this set of variables. The impulse response matching, the DSG is a quarterly frequency. And so what we do, we basically bring these impulse responses to a quarterly frequency to do the impulse response matching. So if you look at the bottom panel here, you're going to see that is not identical to these responses here, because here what we've done was to convert a quarterly frequency in the right, with the right notions, averages for financial assets, and end of period for real quantities, to be able to do the estimation. So that's, if you see a discrepancy between this response and the one in the VAR, is that, for example, for inflation, in the VAR we have an upward blip on impact, which now is negative because we're moving a quarterly frequency, if you consider what happens within the quarter in the VAR. And this was needed to do the estimation. Now, you made a point about, you made a point about heterogeneity, following on Tatjana's point, which again, I fully agree with. The only thing I would stress here is that, and I know that different papers, and we have many of them, if we were to put together a meta-study of what monetary policy shocks do to small open economies, the results, I would say, are a little bit all over the place. And my way to think about it is that we have quite a lot of uncertainty around grouping, which is the heterogeneity point. We have uncertainty coming from the kind of shocks that you use. But crucially, you also have heterogeneity in the sample periods that you consider. And all I want to, the main point I want to make is that these responses are perfectly consistent with a linear combination of various channels that Giovanni described, depending on how strong they are, given the sample period, given the sample of counters that you consider, possibly given the shock that you consider. So taking exactly the same logic, what would happen here is that the oil channel or the commodity price channel is maybe not as strong as you would find. You would maybe be in a part of the sample period where inflation is less responsive to movements in output. We know that these things can matter. We know that the slope of the Phillips curve may have changed over time. So all I wanted to point to is that what we have here is absolutely consistent with all these different channels working in many different directions. It just work out the linear combination of those mechanisms and you could get this. One last point I wanted to make is on oil, which was one of my, exactly where my first, the first thing that came to my mind. So the model has a notion of a very strong response of oil prices to the monetary policy shock, yet the response of CPI is absolutely identical to the one that we have in our baseline. And so that kind of led me to think, well, maybe in these sample periods, this channel was not as prevalent as in previous analysis. Maybe for this set of countries, this channel is not as strong. And a similar logic can apply to, you know, the policy response and so on. But in general, I'm very sympathetic to the comments because I'm very aware that, you know, there is work out there that shows possibly different responses, possibly a different ranking of how important these channels are. And I think, you know, as people who care about these things, we should just, you know, keep on working on this and get to the bottom of it. But I totally recognize that, you know, some of these things are different to what you may have in mind.
One final question, please.